In episode 2 of the ReFi Podcast, John and I have the great pleasure of speaking to Sumedha Deshmukh. She used to be on the blockchain policy team at the World Economic Forum, but now she's gone on to start a PhD at Cambridge University, exploring the dimension of identity access. She tries to help us understand which elements of the system that we're building in Web3 prevent people from accessing the basic services and the transformational technology that's emerging here. It's been a real refreshing listen for me going back over this podcast, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I do apologize about the lack of video on my side. I totally messed up, forgot to press record, so you'll just see an avatar here, but those of you who are listening on the podcast won't even notice. And stay tuned for next week, where we've got another exciting interview with Open Forest Protocol. Hey, well, thanks so much for being here today, guys. It's really fun, Sumedha, to actually meet you in the flesh. Like, this is so unusual for this day and age. And John, we've known each other for, 6 weeks now? And now we're in the same room. This is really cool.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for this kind of convergence of minds and technology in this space. But I would love to hear a bit more about you, Sumedha. We've had a brief conversation, but it felt really opportune to have you as the first guest for this ReFi podcast, looking at the intersection of climate action and crypto. Knowing your background, just love to hear more about where you've come from and kind of what you're seeing in the emergence of this space.
Yeah, so I'll keep it brief, but I came in as quite the skeptic. So at the time, around 2017, I was working in international development. My background's actually economics and policy. So I was looking at emerging economies, international development programs. And around that time, everyone was like, blockchain's going to fix international development. And I was like, no. So I actually came in as a skeptic. I was highly dubious about the claims that people were making about technology to solve these problems that were pretty systemic, deeply embedded in inequality, colonialism, a lot of these kind of long-standing legacies. But as with many people, as you start getting curious about something, I still don't think that blockchain is going to fix international development, but I started getting more and more interested in kind of this new tool set and what we might be able to achieve with new incentive design and just this new opportunity space to recreate or redesign systems that we had kind of taken for granted in the past. So after a little bit of watching on the sidelines, I made the transition to working in policy at the World Economic Forum. Worked there for about 3 years on blockchain and digital assets policy, and then got bored again, wanted to do even more stuff in this space. And so I just started a PhD where I'm going to be looking at a lot of questions around identity and financial regulation and things that are very relevant to this space. So thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I think that really resonates first off. Like, there's this sort of, put it on a blockchain and it'll fix it. And it's like, no, these are tools. People will fix it. And these tools might make it so that people can fix it more effectively and more efficiently. But I think the first thing we need to ask is, like, does it need to be fixed and why? So with international development specifically, like, what problems do you see? Do you think it needs to be fixed? Is there a fixed or improved? And share a little bit about your insight there, maybe.
Yeah. Like I said, I think there are a lot of these things that are quite systemic, right? We've had kind of a long legacy of certain countries with power deciding how the system is structured. So a concrete example that I'm interested in is kind of financial regulation and international financial standards. And so we see a lot of how the system is structured now doesn't necessarily work for the people who are not represented in those processes. So something that we talk about a lot in like Web3 and crypto is this idea of identification and how you show up in the financial system. So we know, like, when you open a bank account, the requirement for a form of ID and a proof of address, that doesn't work for a lot of people. And that's a question that crypto and Web3 has raised. But I think if we really unpack the layers there, a lot of this is because the people who are making the systems don't necessarily have the same vision of money as those who are in emerging economies, or the same vision of accessing financial services. And so I think there's this kind of long legacy of misalignment, or not necessarily having representation of the full suite of end users that we're thinking about with these systems. And so I don't know if it's, you raise a good question. I don't know if it's a fix or something that's going to be fixed, but I think it's a practice of being mindful that these are how the systems have been built historically, and we now have an opportunity to rethink how we're approaching building out these systems.
And do you think that the kind of exclusionary aspect of the system you described, whereby you have to prove your address in order to participate, is that by design, knowing that some 2 billion or more individuals will not have access to the system? Or is that like an unintended consequence of what seemed like a logical choice?
It's hard to say. I wasn't in the room necessarily. I wasn't in the room. Not even necessarily. I know I wasn't in the room. But I think it is. I think a lot of these things are unintended consequences. Like, I think a lot of people don't go in with malintent. This whole scheme is, around something that seems completely independent from basic access to savings. But I think it's a consequence of not living the same experience as somebody who struggles with that access, right? So if you have a driver's license and you have a utility bill, of course you won't question, like, do other people have that? Not because you have malintent towards them, but it's because it's not a part of your experience. And so I think that's an idea that we've talked about a lot, John, of like, there are people that aren't in the room or who've never been in the room, who have decisions made for them as a part of these processes or these systems, that just don't end up working for them. And it's just a matter of their reality not necessarily being represented.
And is that something that we can address with interventions in building these new financial systems on DeFi, to really be conscious of who's not represented and try and create communities and structures and processes that better represent those people who are not at the table for the current financial system? Or what do you kind of see there as an opportunity space to redesign the way the system works using DeFi?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I think we're raising a lot of the right questions. Like, there are a lot of things that have been taken for granted for so long as this is how the system is. And what I'm excited about in the DeFi space is that we're raising questions and we're saying, well, does it have to be this way? And why is it this way? And who is it not working for? And so I think that's always the best place to start, right? Is from a place of curiosity and pushing the boundaries a bit. But what I fear is that we don't make the most of that opportunity by not solving for some of these things. Not that it's going to be solved per se, but not even considering that. Are we building the same types of communities that are not including these people? Are we all the same kind of demographic that are in this Discord channel that's not going to be thinking about a very different mentality around money than what we're used to? And that's, I think, a bit of the risk. And something that actually, like, my supervisor, and I think we've talked about this as well, has said is, if you aren't representing 50% of the people, you're not asking 50% of the questions. So I think that's also a big potential risk, is we're actually missing out on the opportunities or the ways that we can push the boundaries by not having people express a different idea of money or an idea of transacting with people than we're used to, or that same group of people is used to.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think of money as it's a communication system, right? Mm-hmm. It's how we communicate value with each other. And that value is kind of the basis of agreements we can make, and sort of this abstract thing we both can look at and say, okay, I'll give you this, you give me that. Like, there we go. A coordination mechanism. I think there's a couple points you really hit on that I think are so spot on. This idea of that people don't have malintent. I think there's this kind of commonly held belief, like demonization of the elite, that like these are really people who are deliberately exploiting most of the people on earth. And I think, sure, there are a few people like that, right? But I think that's very much the exception rather than the rule. And I think like us kind of appreciating the fact that everybody's probably doing their best, but as you say, we all are looking out at the world from our very limited perspective, right? And there's no way we can see the big picture because we're each just one person. And I think that's kind of, to me, as like a social species, we have the opportunity to kind of collect insights from all of these different perspectives and try to form a more accurate understanding of the whole, and like gather reports from these people who have been to these other parts of life, of our experience, and like, okay, so that might be and use that to sort of triangulate the system that like best serves humanity and kind of best serves
the earth.
Yeah. Right, which is what humanity depends on. I think, and the last piece is, I think you're absolutely right as well, that like solution, or like to solve it or to fix it, kind of like cast it as this binary thing. And it's not, it's a spectrum, right? Like it's always going to be gray mirror. There's going to be some black mirror elements. There's going to be some white mirror. We're never going to hit either completely. And the goal is to kind of make it as light as possible. And I think maybe that's a question, like, in your view, what are we striving towards? Like, what is the white mirror situation that we want to be optimizing for? And maybe kind of thinking in complementary opposites, what are some of the risks and threats and like black mirror outcomes that we want to be most hedging against, I guess?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. A lot to think about there. I think in terms of a white mirror situation, on this idea, really thinking about how we can bring people into the system that have been historically excluded. I think thinking more systematically. So I think so much of the way that systems have been designed thus far, it's siloed and thinking in terms of, this is my little responsibility and everything else is for someone else, right? And I think that's how we've reached this point with the climate crisis. We've reached this point of real urgency, is because we've allowed ourselves to build systems where people aren't fully taking responsibility. And so I think in terms of a white mirror situation, a little more integration and being more mindful of the way that the kind of pieces of the puzzle fit together. And I think, for kind of to the point that you raised, just a recognition that a lot of people are doing their best and trying to utilize those good intentions, but in a way that recognizes each person's good intentions, but also their limitations, right? I think there's not enough recognition of like, here's where my expertise stops and I'm going to need to pull in someone else. There's nothing wrong with that, of saying like, I don't have this perspective. I don't have this expertise. I think in this space, we have the tendency to try to be an expert on everything. Like everyone wants to be an economist and a climate scientist and, you know, everything to everyone, which we don't need to be. So I think those are just some of the things that I would say are aspirational. And then in terms of Black Mirror, I think creating systems that are, I mean, put simply, creating systems that are worse than the ones that we have. Like, let's not be naive. Like, the current state of crypto is not green. Like, the current state of crypto is not inclusive. The current state of crypto is highly speculative and can harm consumers. And if we continue down that path without a very honest recognition of those things, we're going to spiral in a bad way. And so I think even with the best intentions, if there isn't a recognition of the potential ills and the actual ills of what's happening right now, it's things can't move in a positive direction. So I think there's a bit of having to look ourselves in the mirror and have the hard talk of like, where are we today and where do we want to go?
Yeah, and who's missing from the table? I think, John, you act as a great prompt for that at Toucan, especially just kind of having that voice to step back and look at like, hang on a sec, who's here and who isn't? And what are the community that we're building? I'm curious, Sumedha, to hear why you think that crypto is so exclusive.
Yeah, a few things. One, I think an irony of the space is that despite being a space designed to maybe counter the traditional financial system and what we call the walled gardens, I think there's a lot of creating that in this space now. Like a lot of people who are like, I got in at this year. Why do we care when people got in? Like, why is that such a talking point?
Flex, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a flex. And so much jargon and very specific ways that we talk about things that can feel very exclusive and people feel like they can't catch up. And I think, yeah, a lot of guarding of expertise, which I think is detrimental to getting people in who come from other backgrounds that will push us and to be more creative. So right now, a lot of the profiles are people who are highly technical or people who have experience in financial services or people who bring a certain expertise to the table without necessarily thinking of like, what are the other skill sets or backgrounds or things that would be valuable here that are completely outside. So I think like NFTs were a great example of bringing in like an entirely new community of people to the space that brought so much culture and vibrancy that we wouldn't have had unless it was structured in a certain way. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is the architecture of the system, right? Like there are a certain number of people and a very specific type of person that can sit on Discord all day or can, look at Telegram, look at Signal, look at Discord, look at Slack and monitor that all the time. I mean, there's a huge swath of people that for whatever reason can't do that, can't access that. But that's how we're building out these systems, right? And so of course, that's going to favor people who have the time, who have the money, who have the resources to be able to do those things. And so I think, again, that's a bit of a disservice to the space because there are a lot of people that would probably be interested, probably have interesting things to add and contribute, but are never going to make it to those spaces or speak up in those spaces for whatever reason. So I think those are just a few things.
Yeah, it's with all of this like I think it's basically all double-edged swords all the way down, right? Like, I completely hear you on the exclusionary language and memes and like acronyms, NGMI, you know, this whole thing. Like, on one hand, that's exclusive, but I think on the flip side, like, excluding others is a way to help feel included, right? Like, for the insiders, they feel like they're part of something and like, I get it, ha ha ha, like, it's fun. And that is, I think, very attractive for a lot of people. So I think there's probably a needle to thread there as far as, like, to me, one of the most exciting things about this whole thing is that if you go on ethereum.org, right, like, they have cartoons of dogs with sunglasses, right? Like, it's a funny, fun, inviting, like, hey, we want you to come learn about this. This is not deliberately erecting barriers to understanding so that I don't even want to deal with learning about the insurance stuff. Like, I'm just going to buy it because, like, I can't bother reading 50 pages of legalese to try to get to the bottom of what this is, right? It's, let's make it easy for people to understand what the systems that we're basing our kind of money and value exchange and communication, global communication systems, like how those work. And so I guess, like, I think I agree, like, we should be strategic about how we think about this. And it seems to me like, especially this year, Web3 has hit this inflection point where it's gone from being a very delicate fire that needed extremely careful tending or else one breath of air would blow it out, to now it's a raging bonfire that, like, is not going out, and we need to now try to shape and control and make sure that it, like, burns safely. And that is, I suppose, a question to you, maybe, Sumedha, like, looking at this in the short, medium, and long term, right? Like, we can't go appeal to everyone today, right? So what do you see as the critical path and, like, the key dominoes that we want to fall that can help us so that we can quickly but also safely spread the benefits of these technologies and to the broadest group of people, while mitigating the harms and kind of exploitation that just sort of seem to enable? And maybe as a follow-on question now, which we can circle back to, we should talk a little bit about some of the benefits and risks, and, like, just have an honest conversation about that, because I think you're a really good person to dive into that with. But yeah, starting with, what do you see as, I guess, this, like, progressive inclusion?
Yeah. And before I dive into that, I think you make a good point. And thanks for keeping me honest, because I think part of it is the space isn't a monolith, right? So I think there really is a spectrum of projects that are being very intentional and deliberate about inclusion and creating an inclusive space and image for themselves, and frankly, some that are benefiting off of being exclusive and creating those barriers. And so I think even within the space, it's hard to talk about it as a single approach or single way of being around this stuff. So I totally agree. And I think that there are elements of that are strong community building practices, and elements of that are exclusionary. And so I think it's important to kind of think about, like you said, how we thread the needle and how we make sure that a sense of community doesn't cross into an exclusive space. And that's hard. I think that's a question that people have been grappling with for forever, for ages, you know? So yeah. And I think part of that, to kind of get to your question on the short, medium, and long term, I think in the short term, setting up a good foundation is so important. The decisions that are made today are the ones that we're going to look back on in 10 years and going to be the ones that really set the tone for how this technology progresses. So if we think about Web 2.0, 10 to 15 years ago, decisions that they thought were simple or they were making in the moment as they were going quickly ended up being extremely consequential, right? So I think part of it in the short term is setting up a foundation of getting, I'm very passionate about this idea of getting a diverse set of people in the room and really being deliberate about how do we kind of create systems and opportunities to get people in the room who are going to push back on some of the decisions that seem intuitive to a group that is homogenous, but might benefit from someone questioning or pushing back on them. So I think in the short term, just really being deliberate about community building, because I think, I mean, as research shows and as we've heard a million times, having diversity in that decision-making is going to have a lot of knock-on effects for how we build this technology and think about this technology. I think in the medium term, it's a lot about trust building. So I think we're already starting with that within the community. But I think outside of the community, we forget that the vast majority of the population is highly skeptical of this technology. And honestly, in many cases, for good reason, because they don't understand it or they've seen news about it that's not flattering, or they're, there's a myriad reasons that they don't trust this technology. They don't trust the people in the technology. And that's the layperson, that's the regulator, that's the policymaker. I think there's going to be kind of a medium term like PR campaign, honestly, around Web3 that's going to need to happen of getting people understanding things in a way that resonates. And I think part of that is the demographic of people that's been involved. I feel like people always lead with like, this is how blockchain works. This is how we build trust through a decentralized network. And then they're talking about nodes and they're, saying all these things.
hashing algorithm. Yeah.
But I always ask people, I'm like, can you explain to me how an email is sent? No.
Yeah.
You use email every day.
Yeah, I don't care.
You don't care how it works.
Type it out,
you don't
click
need to
the
know.
button. Yeah.
You know what the value of it is to you.
Right.
And
right.
you don't care to get into the guts of it. And I think there's going to be that medium term campaign of like expressing the value and expressing the use cases that are going to matter to people without being tech first about it.
I think though I know there's a long-term one, so I don't want to divert, but I think we should dive into this a little bit because it's a nuanced thing, because like email is a major upgrade from before, which is like I have to write a message on a physical piece of paper and put it in another physical and put a stamp on it and send it, and someone has to take it there. And now suddenly like a message can appear in my face in my room but how, like from a user's perspective, me using stable coins on Celo or Ethereum and me using Monzo, there's no functional difference, right? Like
on the surface.
Yeah, from a user's perspective. I type in your identity, your account, and how much I want to send you, and I push go, and a second later it shows up in your...
But actually, I guess there is, the reason I got into the whole space is, the monetary aspect. It's like on Celo, if you hold CEUR, so like the Celo version of the Euro stablecoin, it's like 50% yield per year. So there is actually that kind of initial perk where these networks are investing in incentives to provide people reasons to use Celo in Valora instead of Monzo. And so I think we have to understand that there are some really hard monetary incentives driving a lot of growth in this space. Yeah. But I think those are all short-term things. And actually, it's the longer-term, deeper aspects of these systems of an alternative open financial system that could be designed to meet the needs of an entire global populace, as opposed to a closed financial system that's really been designed to meet the needs of, financial institutions and central banks.
I do think there is a point, though, that like maybe that actually breeds mistrust. Like if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it probably is. So if I'm getting 50%, when at my bank I'm getting 0.02% interest, like you made 3 cents this year. Like I'm gonna say, hold on a second, there's something fishy here, even if it's completely legitimate. But yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. But I also wonder, like, there's probably a lot, and I probably am myself one of these people where that doesn't necessarily matter that much. Like that's not a big driver for me. And I don't know, like, what do you think about that from this like almost like yield perspective or interest? Do you think that is going to draw
from a perspective of inclusion, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think different things will bring different people to the space. Financial incentives, I think, yeah, they help. But it depends, again, who has access to that knowledge and access to the information that they're going to receive this kind of yield, that they can even enter the system.
What even is yield?
Yeah. What even is yield?
Yeah.
And so I think that could be, but I think that's the task of the space right now, right? Is to build products that add value and that work for people. If we can't express that, then sure, maybe we should all be using Monzo. Like, you know, what's the point if it's not going to add value to someone's life? And so I think, not to be too much of an economist about it, but I think that's part of what the market forces are going to sort out too, is what are the products that are actually bringing value to people? And I think if we're not really deliberate about that beyond the use case of speculation, then yeah, it's going to be a tough sell. And so
Totally.
I think a big one is, I've only been really realizing this recently, to be honest, but like the gaming and collectibles dimension and kind of culture. And also, I think the portable identity. The fact that I can go log into one website and you can see my profile picture, and I log into another one and you can see the same one. That is quite a compelling thing that it's a bit of a paradigm shift. Like the fact that I own my identity and I take it with me wherever I go. But I do think in any case, like it's a pretty nuanced, like kind of, you got to be really curious about how these systems work to understand why they're different even, you know?
I would say yes and no. I think part of it is also these systems don't exist in a vacuum, right? So as much as we want to build trust of the ecosystem for the ecosystem, there's also a lot of distrust in the current financial system and a lot of distrust in political systems, whatever. So I think that at the same time, there is this kind of push factor that is driving people to be interested in this space. And so I think it's also recognizing the kind of realities that people are facing and unpacking what's at the root of some of the distrust and what's at the root of why people are looking for an alternative and then building for that, right? And I think when you start with that approach, then it's also easier to have that conversation with people. I've found, at least personally, that it feels more intuitive when you're coming to them with an understanding of their perspective. And again, that's gonna be very different for each person. So maybe it's distrust of the system, maybe it's lack of access, maybe it's this just squares better with your perception of money and value exchange. I think there are going to be a number of different avenues and messages that will have to be crafted for different people.
Yeah, I'm curious, John, what was your like early perceptions kind of when these ideas started kind of coming into your awareness, and then what captured your attention? And
yeah, likewise. I think it's always fascinating to see the different people that influenced somebody else to get into the space, because it's often individuals as opposed to ideas, and it's the relationships, I think, that I've seen as a pattern. But for me, growing up in the States, Bitcoin was, a term that was thrown around, and I never really cared that much. My grandfather was, a day trader in stocks, and he taught me a lot about the stock market, but I didn't really get super interested into it. But I liked the internet, I was playing around, coding stuff, and it really wasn't until this year. So I got into it in May because I had seen a couple of my friends make life-changing amounts of money in crypto. And so as somebody who has spent the last 3 years pretty exclusively dedicated to looking at how I can address climate change, it was funny that that was the hook for me.
Yeah.
Because that's not normally my primary motivation, but it was like a couple buddies that had gotten in quite early and had now done incredibly well because of all the growth that the pandemic stimulated. I was kind of compelled to dig deeper, but it was really the conjunction of making money alongside this notion of DeFi, of a decentralized financial system, that seemed just so fascinating to me, so exciting, in the same way that I was playing around in my room as a kid, playing video games and making video games, messing around with code, copy paste here and there. The idea of being able to create financial products and financial systems like a game seemed really compelling to me. And as soon as I glimpsed the different actors in this system and realized that all of these protocols are open source, I just had this kind of flash image of how, if this was designed properly, it could really address the climate crisis in a particular way at scale that the current system just can't seem to do.
What do you think about it holds such promise? Like, what are the characteristics that really were connected with you?
Yeah, I think the idea of it being open, so you can see the transactions of any of the protocols you care about. Like, I can look and see what MakerDAO is doing with DAI in the background, whereas I don't know what Monzo's doing with all that money. I have no idea what they're really investing that in. And I think that's really interesting. But to me, being able to create a bridge from the physical world and the natural resources that we all depend upon, and to create these digital representations, either in the form of tokens and coins or NFTs and art or whatever else, to try and protect these natural resources that our current monetary system is failing to protect. And in fact, the only way we create money in this current world is we destroy the earth or we take away from some type of human capital. And so if we can create systems that basically reverse that paradigm and create digital money by protecting the earth and doing things like sequestering carbon or, mitigating carbon emissions, I think that to me is incredibly powerful, because that basically allows for us to, if we can think about money, if we can dream about it, if we can design it, then we can make it. And similarly with your piece, Sumedha, around, designing the people that come to the table, we can really build these new communities and these new assets with that expressed intent, and publicly say, look, we want to both preserve this natural resource, say a forest or a lake, and we also want to provide the indigenous people who historically had stewarded that with a stake at the table, where previously they'd been pushed out because of fossil fuel interest or whatever it was. And if you make that kind of public commitment, that sort of social contract, and you do it on chain, on the blockchain, everyone holds you accountable, because there's nothing you can do that's hidden. And I think that kind of radical transparency and programmability of money and ideas into the world of the internet has incredible potential to change the world. And it's really the first time I've been optimistic about humanity's ability to address climate change ever. I was super depressed ever since I started learning about the science. And it's only now in seeing how this emergent technology could be used that I'm like, okay, I might not have to look at my son in the eyes in 10 years and be like, sorry, mate. So yeah, I'm curious if that resonates with you guys.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. First, I think, you raise a good point that the transparency doesn't matter without the accountability piece. So if we have all of this information, but we're not actually expressing intent to hold protocols accountable or hold ourselves accountable, I think that's a big piece that we have to design for that will be a deciding factor between whether this thing helps or hurts. So I think that's something that we need to be really deliberate about. The other thing that it just made me think of is, just the way that we're designing systems and designing with the idea of collective action. So I think in economics, there's always this kind of starting point of the self-interested, rational human. And it's very like kind of a bleak picture of humanity of we're all just acting in our self-interest. And I think part of what this gives us the option and opportunity for is how do we question that premise a little bit? And how do we, obviously saving the planet and like staying on the planet is an item of self-interest in my opinion. But there's also, I think, what economists have considered altruism in the past. I think there's an element of that that's really surfacing, of people really caring about something and being really motivated and driven by something outside of themselves that traditional models haven't accounted for. And so I think taking a more, like you said, optimistic view of humans, there's really, I think, an opportunity space in that if we question that premise a little bit and push on it. And I think this idea has gotten a lot of pickup in the crypto space with, like Eleanor Ostrom's work on governing the commons, which I think gets at a lot of these ideas is, maybe people aren't so bad and aren't so evil. They have some common interests in mind. And how do we design systems with that in mind and design systems to kind of encourage some of that stewarding behavior?
Yeah, I almost wonder if this sort of like Homo economicus, like people are behaving in that way because they're in an environment where they're taught that that's the expected behavior. Like, oh, this is what everybody else is doing. So like, I'll be stupid not to, which is true, right? It's this sort of like suboptimal coordination point or like strategy that doesn't serve everyone, but everybody kind of does okay. And I think, like, to me, the essence of this new field of crypto economics, and I don't know if it's necessarily specifically crypto economics, but I think crypto and consensus networks and smart contracts bring in new tools that are enabling a lot of innovation and kind of experimentation here is how can we align the individual self-interest with the collective self-interest so that me pursuing my own well-being and like looking after myself is actually strengthening the health of the whole, right? This is kind of like the essence of the proof of work. Bitcoin consensus mechanism is like, I put my computer on the network and run it because I get paid in Bitcoin. But the more people that do that, the more hash power on the network, and therefore the more secure the network, right? So I think I'm like getting really excited thinking through a lot about that of kind of bending the individual self-interest into alignment with the whole, with the collective. I think though, on the point of the self-interested human, it feels to me like it's important to bring in the time dimension to that, right? Like, I can be self-interested in the next 3 minutes, in which case, like, I eat the whole bar of chocolate. Or if I'm thinking in terms of 30 minutes, maybe I won't. And likewise here, like, if we're thinking on a quarterly basis, we're going to make very different decisions than if we're thinking on the order of centuries or millennia. And I don't know how we go about shifting the scales on which we're thinking about what's in our self-interest. Like, what do you think? How?
I want to jump in there because I think the timescales is one interesting element, but I think it's also about the story of the self that's been predominant throughout history. And I think the economic theory arose at a particular point in time where the story of the self was very much individualistic. And the idea of a rational, self-interested actor was resonant with the idea of the self at the time. And I've been so grateful to Sep Kamvar at Cello for introducing me to Charles Eisenstein's work, particularly Sacred Economics, where he really kind of breaks down the flaws with that story of the self and show how so much of our society and its ills are a direct result of that story. And it is just a story. And it is just a construct of belief in essence. And when you start to realize that a story is, a series of fictional narratives of ideas made up in our minds, it becomes quite empowering because you can deconstruct and then reconstruct it. And I think the idea of starting to tell a new story about the self, which is not separate from the other, but interdependent and integrated. And similarly to the earth, if we can begin to tell a new story that says we all need each other and we all depend on each other for survival, and we need the earth to survive. And actually, this is the new identity, is one that both embraces, the uniqueness of the individual, but also the connectedness of the whole, and can create monetary systems and value structures that support that story. I think the time piece, the time preference aspect will solve itself in that lens. And I think, if you look in human history, the communities that had a less individualistic story of the self and was more community driven, those are the ones that were thinking to the seventh generation. It was because their identity was rooted in the whole. And so I think that's really one of the core tenets that I want to propose as heart of this regenerative finance movement is the story of a self that is not separate. The story of the self that is utterly dependent upon the other and upon the earth. So curious what that strikes with you.
Yeah, I totally agree. Couldn't agree more that it's a story and it's a concept that we've anchored on that is at its core value laden and subjective, right? So that's something that we have a bit of flexibility with of, okay, why do we not include the idea of community and belonging, for example, in self-interest in the traditional sense? That's something that's, in my opinion, self-interested, is to have a sense of community and belonging, but not necessarily in the graphs that I draw in economics, in my utility curve or whatever, which is the very cut and dry version of the human, right? And I think it's also quite a Western concept. I talked a little bit earlier about how I grew up seeing very different conceptions of money and transacting and value. So when I go shopping in India, in my grandparents' neighborhood, they've had a tab on their local grocery store and they just go and pay it whenever they want. And I could just go as a kid and go pick out cookies. And I walked into the store, they knew who my grandparents were. They put it on the tab and I left. And can you imagine doing that here? It's just a very different conception of money. And they're it's just very community based. It's very belonging based. It's just a very different conception of money and the way that, they think about these things. And and the fact that the community is small enough that I'm this rando American kid that comes in and they're I know exactly who you are.
Yeah.
It's very different.
That's really sweet.
And same with, like you said, people's relationship to the environment, I think in other places is quite different. There are many cultures where that's your self-interest, is you're protecting and one with the place that you call home. And I think there's now an opportunity to kind of bring in some of those varying realities and varying expressions of self-interest into a new story, as you say, for what it is.
I think it's, again, a double-edged sword, or there's a nuance here, right? Because, at the end of the day, when I think about what I am and what I'm not, I'm drawing a boundary in my mind, right? That's okay, this is the edge of me, and that's you. You're not me. I'm myself, you're yourself. And that boundary is in my mind. It's a perception, but at the same time, there's a lot of value in segmenting the world up and identifying these patterns and similarities and differences, and kind of thinking in terms of like, what is the unit of observation, right? We can kind of, at the end of the day, every system collapses into one system, which is the universe. Like, every system is a part of this broader system. But that doesn't mean that it's not useful to look at these specific systems and try to draw a boundary and understand the dynamics within the system and how it interfaces with other systems. And I think maybe we haven't been particularly thoughtful historically about like the power that we're exercising by drawing that boundary, right? Like, and identifying, like, we put a lot of our own kind of worldview in when we say this is the edge of the system and these are the things that we're measuring about it that are like the key things that are functioning there. So that, I think, deserves a lot of kind of examination. Like, where's this boundary? Where would somebody else draw it? Is there even a boundary? But so I suppose like the overall point I'm trying to make is that we have this like paradox of, on one hand, we all are part of the same thing and like we're all kind of participating in this together. We're one another. But on the other hand, we each are our own individual people, agents in the system with our own kind of autonomy and interests and desires and fears, and how can we preserve what should be preserved in the individualist point while also making sure that like the collectivist side of the equation is balanced and is like sort of an unfinished thought there. There'll probably be a lot of those.
Yeah. No, I think you're getting at something interesting though, because this is really what's happening with the pandemic. Is this massive experiment of like, okay, so you think this is just about you and your needs? How does it feel to be locked up in a small flat with no access to nature or human human connection? How does that feel?
Yeah.
And the health of a system, if you say, like the biological closed loop of your skin and
Right.
all its contents, like begins to degrade without human interaction.
Right.
Like, we are social creatures. We depend upon eye contact, and we depend upon those small moments of body language and those gestures. And similarly, excluded from nature, our cortisol levels go up and sleep becomes worse. And so like diving into the science of well-being over the last 12 or so months, I found it so fascinating how time and time again, it's very clear that that individualist story of the self doesn't make us well. And I think that should be a really strong signal for where to draw those boundaries, because all these systems have feedback loops. And this is just one element of feedback, is health. And I think this is where we're kind of, again, beginning to tap into the whole crypto economics. What's possible is begin to take in new data points of feedback, because the current monetary system doesn't have a feedback mechanism for biodiversity loss. It doesn't have a feedback mechanism for human health or human happiness or atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And now this is what we live in, is we've got exponential growth of, supply of money and lots of capital assets, which seem to be growing in value. But like biodiversity is collapsing, human health is degrading, CO2 keeps going up. And it's like, I think this is beginning to creak the system that we've built. And now it's like, okay, what do we do with this? How do we begin to build these feedback loops into society such that we can create a new system that takes care of those who are excluded? And yeah, so I don't know what your thoughts are on that in terms of
Yeah, I think you're raising a really good point. And I think part of this is historically, I think there's this saying like, what's measured matters. And so we've had certain things that we're measuring or certain things that we're on top of and that we're considering as the success metrics that haven't really been integrating other aspects like well-being or environmental effects. And I think we're moving in that direction, but I worry that it could be too little too late, because we already know that, measurements that we developed in the past and things that we've looked at as success metrics, even those were not great measurements. Like GDP, which we use for everything, is like a pretty fraught and not good measurement, yet it's historically extremely important and something that we value. And now we're starting to be like, okay, quick, we need to measure environmental impact. We need to measure things like well-being. How do you even start to think about those things? But those are the things that kind of create the boundaries that you were talking about, like, and how we envision us versus the collective. And so, I think there's that's also kind of an incomplete thought, but I think we really have to, as we're designing new systems, be deliberate about how are we measuring success? How are we thinking about these things? Because if we're using the same old measurements, I think we're going to be creating the same types of systems.
I really, really think you hit a very, very important point, that once again, like, we are embedding our worldview and our values into everything by designing the measurement systems, right? Like, what measurement, like, I think it's absolutely ludicrous to think that we can condense the infinite complexity of the world into like a number. Like, are you insane? Like, oh, how are you? Oh, 7. Like, what are you talking about? But again, flip side, like, it is important to be able to, I don't know, like, I think there is value there, but I think we kind of like have fallen into this over quantification and optimization, which I don't know what that's driven by, just this sort of like hyper rationalization of the world and this lack of appreciation for the value of the subjective or emotional or kind of moral experience. But I think, like, to me, I think about this a lot because a lot of my work in the past has been around how do we measure? How do we measure the world? And how do we pluck insights about the world from those measurements and, distill those measurements? That's, to me, like, essentially what data science is, right? Is like distilling reams of information into things that are kind of actionable and
Makes sense.
Insight can be drawn from. It feels to me very much like we need to shift our thinking around this so that it's a much more evolving thing. Like, we should be measuring what values, which means we need to have an estimation of what we value. How do we assess collectively what we value? And that's going to change over time. And then how do we measure and kind of parameterize those values, or like identify key metrics about those values, and ensuring that our society is kind of acting in accordance with those values and identifying when things start to stray. And I mean, but to say like, okay, cool, like we figured it out, and like here's the biodiversity metric, is ridiculous, because in next year there are satellites going up in space that are going to open up a whole new field for us to measure that, right? And all the time our technologies are improving and our systems of measurement and verification are improving. So it almost feels like shifting our mindset to like being humble about the measurement, and also trying to create a more adaptable kind of evolutionary systems of measurement that evolve with the times and improve over time. But I think it's spot on that like that's a really fraught thing. It's a necessary evil, but we need to recognize that as an evil, or maybe not an evil, but like, see what I'm saying?
Go for it. Yeah, I think there's some interesting things emerging, though, because even just then creating a series of metrics by which to measure the success of humanity against something abstract like GDP, we're making progress. That's a start in the right direction. And even then, recognizing if you're measuring for biodiversity, knowing that your initial measurement may not be the full scope of the system, but it's a start. And I think having that intellectual humility, like you said, is beautiful. But I think what's fascinating here is we can begin to see kind of the role of money in representing what we value. And throughout history, if you look back, it's like, from the time that the gold standard was removed, gold backed the dollar, say, but you couldn't really exchange the dollar for gold. You couldn't just go to the bank and say, here's 1,000, give me 1,000 worth. That wasn't the precedent. So really the backing is kind of the measurement, was just the justification to believe in a story. And before that, the British pound was a pound of sterling silver. And, the empire was built upon these prospects, and, looking at money before that being backed upon military power and different metals. It's like really representing what seemed to matter the most in that period of time. And so if we can create a new internet where we're backing different currencies with different things that we value, that we can measure in a kind of blockchain world, I think what we start to see is the proliferation of a single unified monolithic monetary system into a more diverse spectrum of there's different communities who are valuing different things and doing different work to create new systems that circulate different flows of value to different places. And I think that to me is super exciting, that you break down the kind of fragility of a centralized global monetary system with an abstract backing of, the dollar, right? Because it's all rooted on that. And that seems to me more like the ecology of life. It's super diverse. There's super, high contrast in terms of the organisms in a system. And I don't know, it feels like we're headed in the right direction, but we've got to obviously be careful how we grow these systems and build out new forms of money.
Yeah, a lot there. I think to your point, as difficult as it can be, I think measurement is a tool of trust. So a lot of times we're looking to understand something better, and measurement kind of helps us wrap our heads around it. And so I think that's one thing. And I think as it being a part of trust, it's a communication tool. So if we think about the climate crisis, we were able to create a sense of urgency around it because we're able to rally behind some of these measurements and some of these numbers that we can understand communally and get our heads around, right? That being said, to your point, John, I think we have to recognize that the measurements are inherently based on someone or some group's values. And so I think we need to, think about who's represented in deciding what those values are, and how do we, to your point, also saying how do we create a broader picture of what values are represented in some of those measurements? Because I think that's the key to building a broader base of trust than what we currently have.
Yeah, I think another way to think about it is we're taking these measurements so we can make a map, right? But the map is not the territory. Mm-hmm. And the map maker has a huge amount of power in representing what's important there, right? And so maybe another way to put it is let's get as many map makers in the room so we can make as rich and accurate a map of all of this as we can. I wonder though, I think this concept of the speciation of money, as in it's diversifying and there's all these different forms that are kind of emerging, I think is fascinating. And I think a lot about one of the big reasons I'm drawn to Web3, and I use that term knowing it's fraught and unclear, and I think we need to revisit what that exactly means to us soon. But I'm drawn to it in large part because it is a permissionless innovation environment. And when I say permissionless, I mean you don't need to go get approval or certification or a degree or even a particular job in order to contribute to creativity, right? And that's like a blinding contrast to the traditional monetary system, in which, like, if you want to innovate with how money works, you
Get permission.
go get a job at a central bank, right? And to get a job at a central bank, you got to be in an extremely narrow subset of humanity to even get an interview, you know? So I think though, like, I want to examine the counterpoint to this, like, ooh, like, let's just let the diversification of money flourish, and like, let's kind of let these forces of evolution be applied here. What's the counterpoint? Like, what are the fears or the risks or the hesitations that we should be considering? Like, what are the benefits of the monoculture, right? Like, what do we want to preserve? Because this is, like, I think about this a lot. Most of what we have is working. Like, we're here. Life's pretty good, at least for us. I mean, life's pretty good for a lot of people. And so for us to say, like, throw it all out and start over is, first of all, it's just not going to happen. That's not how it's going to work. And it's a bit naive to think it can. So instead, it's about identifying the characteristics and the patterns and the habits that serve us as humanity, and like the probably 5 or 10% that is rotten and structurally corrupt, and like somehow figuring out a way to kind of split that off, leave that behind, and bring the rest forward, because that is kind of evolved by generations and generations of people doing their best to build a better world. So yeah, I think especially from your perspective, Sumedha, having been in some of these conversations with people who are innovating with how money works within the sort of bounds of the regulated institutional environment or context, what do you see as the appetite for promoting the speciation of money, the diversification of money, and what are some of the hesitations you might expect to hear?
Yeah, this is a big question and a good question. I think one of the biggest issues with the current financial system is that for people who already have money, it's relatively easy to make a lot more money. For people who don't have money, it costs a lot of money to have money, make money, etc. They're kind of opposing trajectories. And I think that's what's led to a lot of the inequality that we've seen today. That's kind of fueled by the way that the current system is structured. So obviously, if you're on the side where you have money, you're making money easily, like, you don't have many complaints about the current financial system. And probably you're entering a space like Web3 because you see the potential to make even more money. For the people who are on the other end of the spectrum, where they are hit with overdraft fees, they can't borrow money because they have a bad credit score or no credit score. They can't access basic banking because they don't have a utility bill. These are very frustrating elements of the current system. They're locking people out and creating a disparity of opportunity that is really structural and hard to see. So I think that's an opportunity space, right? Of like, how do we think beyond just the speculation and think of like, what are the really salient problems with the ways that things are structured currently? And so I think that's a big part of it. And I think in terms of what to preserve about the system or to improve about the current system, I think this idea of trust is huge, right? So people who maybe don't have access to the financial system in the same way, they're distrusting of the financial system. But there are a fair amount of people who do trust the financial system, and they do trust commercial banks with their life savings. And that's not a small task, right? I think there are a lot of projects in the space that are working in earnest and they're trying to make something good, but there are also projects that are not. And they're exploiting people who don't have sophisticated knowledge, or they're not structured in a way that's easy to use for people that don't have sophisticated knowledge, which can be dangerous for money that matters to people. You know, people's life savings. That's not a joke.
It's not a joke.
And so I think that idea of trust and having a user experience and a system that people can trust and should trust is going to be really important. And I think commercial banks, it's their business model to build that trust, to maintain that trust. And they do a lot of work. They spend a lot of money to do that. And so I think there's going to be this task for the Web3 space to really think through that and like, how do they enable that for a broad consumer base?
I'd love to get into some of those trust elements in a second, but I want to touch on what you said about the core feature of our current monetary system is that those who have money make more money easily, and those who don't have money find it really hard and are basically taxed on a poverty tax basis. What, in your opinion, is the core feature of the system that makes that true?
I think it's a very complicated question. I think a few different things. At the end of the day, commercial banks, the financial system, it's a business. So they're thinking in terms of how do we have a business model that's sustainable. And on their side, a wealthy customer is a customer that makes more money for them and is depositing a lot of money. And a customer that's not wealthy is maybe presenting a risk, a default risk, or something that could cost the commercial bank money. And so in the way that the current system is structured, those costs are kind of passed on to the customer. And they're kind of in this systemic loop of, I don't have money, I'm paying to borrow money, and I can't make money because I've already paid to borrow this money.
And I can't buy enough groceries to reduce my food expenditure by buying nice things, so I have to buy, meal at a time, and everything's super expensive as a result of it. But
exactly.
if I had, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 to just bulk up on food, I could reduce my food expenditure and, make things work. So they're kind of stuck in this loop. But I guess I'm trying to understand, is it that commercial banks have to pay interest to, central banks in order to have the money that they get to loan out? Is it this kind of interest-bearing debt model that really enslaves all of, society to this trajectory of growth? On one hand, if you've got money, you can easily grow it. And on the other hand, if you don't have money, like, you're enslaved to that debt burden. Like, I'm just curious to understand, like, what if there's any specific feature in the system that you would pinpoint as resulting in this kind of polarization and exacerbation of the accumulation of wealth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partially the business, like commercial banking business model, and the desire to kind of extract as much value from the system as possible. I think part of it is the way that social safety nets are structured and this idea of externalities, right? And how we're accounting for welfare of individuals and welfare of society. I think there are a lot of different things. The fact that, like, again, going back to this idea of like what measures or what's measured matters, people having a financial identity is so important to being able to access capital. So if you don't have a credit score, you can't access capital. But if you don't have access to a credit or like a credit card or to the financial service to begin with, you're just going to be trapped in a system where you're left out, borrowing money at a higher expense. I think there are just a lot of pieces that, to kind of go back to the start of our conversation, were maybe not designed with malintent, but have created bad consequences for people that were not necessarily fully considered in the scope of designing the system. And I mean, to give a very concrete example, the identity requirements, as a lot of people in the space know, are tied to know your customer and anti-money laundering international financial standards, which were A, created by developed countries without representation from developing countries, and B, not designed with financial inclusion in mind. The main goal is financial integrity. And it's only been very recently that they've realized, like, oh, there are consequences for inclusion, but at the end of the day, that's not the goal. So we're piecemealing many parts of the system together, and that's, I think, creating a bunch of different contributing factors to this overall problem.
I'm just, flash of mind, is there a way that we can almost foster a gift economy where people who've made so much in this Web3 space can basically gift people from the developing world who can't bypass that KYC, here's my ID and address? Like, is there something that we can do that subverts the existing financial institutional biases to help bring people on board and overcome that barrier of exclusion? Like, I'm really craving to find specific things that we can do now that don't depend upon waiting for large international bodies to make up their mind about how to help people have access to financial products. I'm not sure if anything comes to mind.
I mean, I'm sure there are things we can do, but it doesn't feel like that's like a durable solution, you know? Like, that's I mean, yeah, I think philanthropy and trying to invest in like regenerative or community positive or planet positive projects, like there's a lot of really exciting activity going on in Web3 on how we can connect capital that's living in the crypto ecosystem with those kinds of things. It's tricky. How do you know who you're giving it to? Are you giving it to people who are going to abuse those resources or not? I mean, yeah, it's a complex thing. I think, well, I've got a kind of a left field question. Should a bank be a business? Should a bank have a profit motive?
Who are we to decide?
Yeah.
Well, or maybe put it another way, like, yeah, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of a bank, right? And
now versus when there's central bank digital currencies, like there's several layers to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some stuff to follow up on. What do you think, Sumedha?
It's a big question. I think I find it hard to envision, like maybe I'm not creative enough. I find it hard to envision how the system would run without the business model, because I think we already see the ways in which funding public goods from like a not from a Web3 perspective, but from a like pure public goods government perspective also has its own set of challenges and issues. I don't know. I think it's interesting because even from a developing economy perspective, there are all of these like very interesting examples of like bank alternatives. But at the end of the day, they all do kind of have a business model to them. So like an example is something that's called like a rotating savings group. So people will pool money together and as a community, and then they'll lend it out to someone within the group, like once a week for like a cycle of 6 weeks or something like that. So it's not like a profit motivation per se, but there's still something that's business-like about it, if that makes sense. So you're contributing every week, and then you'll get it once in 6 weeks, and you're making money off of that. I struggle with that question, to be honest.
I think maybe like, yeah, this is definitely getting into something we probably is beyond the scope of this conversation, but I think there's something to do with regeneration here, right? Like, to me, regeneration, I mean, this is what the purpose of these conversations is, in my view, is to try to understand what that word means. But a big part of it is that, like, something is regenerative if it creates more than it consumes. So profit is a form of regeneration, right? Like, I'm taking something, investing it, or producing something, and then getting more back than I spent, and then I'm able to continue to do that. And like, because otherwise, if it's degenerative or kind of over time value leaches out of the system and is drained, then that doesn't, like, it's almost like, you know, with life, you have to maintain this electrochemical gradient, or else like the cell dies and kind of falls into entropy. Similar idea with this. So it's whether or not it's a business, I think point taken that, like, there needs to be some kind of flow where more value is flowing in than is flowing out. Otherwise, it will cease to exist. In any case, yeah, I think...
I just want to touch on that because I think there is something interesting here. In Sacred Economics, he talks a lot about depreciating currency and what would happen if we lived in a world with a depreciating currency and negative interest. And actually, it would change the incentive structures such that we weren't incentivized to accumulate and store money for the sake of it, because actually you can grow money more that way. But if you were incentivized to move money through the system in a way that created value and added to, you know, the living systems of the earth that made the world more beautiful, and it wasn't just like money for money's sake. Because the reality is, like, in order to achieve that profit that you've just described from that lens, like, some natural resource has to be taken and converted into money, or some human value has to be taken and converted into money for that profit to arise and for us to fuel this infinite loop of debt. And so I think there's some really radical ideas at the heart of a kind of transition economy that moves away from this infinite growing abstract exchange of value that is money, which is destroying the earth and destroying human systems and community, towards something that can be sustained over a long period of time for the good of, you know, the many and not just the few. And I think that, to me, is really the thesis here, is in the intersection of DeFi and climate action, DeFi and social justice, DeFi and biological regeneration. Are there some really radical new ideas that we can use with this whole new world of technology to address these core systemic problems that the existing world has failed to address? And I think there is, but there's just so many hurdles along the way. And so I'm so grateful, Sumedha, that you've raised the points that you have and brought the presence that you did today. And just, yeah, I'm so amazed that all of this has happened in such a short period of time. And like, it's been really, really fun chatting with you all today. I don't know if there's anything else that you guys want to touch on before we wrap up.
I've got one last question, and maybe we kind of already touched on it with the progressive inclusion and like dominoes, but what do you see as the leverage points in a system? Like, what are, if we're all resource constrained, right? Where should we be focusing our attention if we wanted to make like the greatest shift towards this white mirror outcome? Now or soon or ever, whatever. Leverage point.
$1 million question. I think, I mean, not to sound like a broken record, but I do think a baseline is starting with strong communities. So regardless of the project, I think I will keep hitting this home of like just trying to bring in different perspectives and different voices, because I think that's going to shape a much stronger trajectory for whatever project we decide. In terms of like the actual things that we're investing our time and energy and resources into, I think projects that are taking kind of this integrative approach of, looking beyond one aspect of things and saying like, how are we thinking across different metrics? I think that's a point that's going to lead to better outcomes, I think. And I think this, like, I don't know if this is really answering the question that you're asking, but I think these projects that have the kind of regenerative mindset, that's like a great place to start. And trying to align some of the ways that we have economic incentives with some of the broader goals of saving our planet, bringing people into the system. I think that's a really strong and important place to start. I wish I had the answer of like exactly what is going to be that. I mean, I think like if I had that answer, I would drop out of my PhD, start that company and just do it. But yeah, I mean, I think like just the very important thing right now is to be like very mindful of like how we're building things, what we're building, and who's building them. And I think when we start from that foundation, we will hopefully be creating products and projects that are heading in a more white mirror direction than not.
Well said.
Well, this has been fun.
Thanks so much for coming on today, Sumedha. It's really great to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you. And thanks for having me.
Looking forward to many more conversations.
Cheers.